This program is sponsored by Hotel Nepal, Thomel, Kathmandu.
Himalaya Airlines, connecting Nepal to Doha, Colombo, Kuala Lumpur and Yangon.
दर्शकबिन नमस्कार। राष्ट्र विकासका लागि आर्थिक बहस यो बिजनेस टेलिभिजन र बिजनेस टेलिभिजनको विशेष प्रस्तुति बीटीवी विशेषमा यहाँलाई स्वागत छ। बीटीवी विशेषमा हामी विशेष व्यक्तिसँग विशेष सन्दर्भमा विशेष कुराकानी गर्ने गर्छौं र यो सन्दर्भमा आज हामी इन्टरनेशनल लेबर अर्गनाइजेसन अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय श्रम संगठन जुन एउटा युएनको एउटा बडी हो र नेपालमा के काम गरिरहेको छ यो विषयमा आज हामी कुरा गर्दै छौं। हामीसँग डाक्टर रिचर्ड हावार्ड हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँ चाहिँ आईएलओ अफिस नेपालका चाहिँ डाइरेक्टर हुनुहुन्छ, खास गरी कन्ट्री डाइरेक्टर। हामी उहाँसँग आज नेपालमा लेबरको सिचुएसन कस्तो छ, इम्प्लोइ र इम्प्लोयर बीचको चाहिँ सम्बन्ध कस्तो छ, विभिन्न नयाँ ऐनहरू आएका छन् त्यसमा आईएलओले कस्तो रोल प्ले गरेको छ यो विषयमा कुरा गर्नेछौँ। हामी उहाँलाई स्वागत गर्छौँ। वेलकम टु बिजनेस टेलिभिजन सर।
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
First of all, I'd like to know the role of ILO, how it works, how it functions in Nepal.
Well, globally, the ILO's main purpose is to set international labor standards, so standards that determine conditions of work for workers all over the world. And the ILO is a UN organization, one of the oldest UN organizations, and it's comprised of 3 different constituencies. And the idea is that these 3 constituencies work together to negotiate solutions that work for 2 things. One is for promoting jobs growth, and the second is for ensuring that those jobs are decent or fair for workers. So those 3 groups that make up the ILO are governments, ministries of labor, trade unions, workers' organizations, and organizations of employers, mostly representing the private sector, businesses. So the idea is you bring these 3 groups together globally, and they set the standards for workers throughout the world. And then that structure replicates down to the country level. So here in Nepal, we are represented by the Ministry of Labor, trade union confederations, and employers' organizations like FNCCI and CNI participate in the ILO. So the idea is that we need each of those 3 perspectives to negotiate conditions of work that are right for Nepal. And they're not necessarily going to be the same for Nepal as they are for other countries.
There are lots of positive aspects of ILO, no doubt. But there are some paradox and negative aspects as well, criticized by market. From where we start? What do you want? Do you want to get positive questions first or negative questions first?
I prefer we start with a negative.
Okay, it's fine.
And then maybe I'll leave early.
Yeah, okay.
No.
Okay, so there are some, we can say, paradox. In country like Nepal, where there is supposed to be the necessity of the workforce work decently rather than looking for right. ILO sometimes gets involved in encouraging some labor unions for right. What do you say?
It's true. We do support labor unions to advocate for their rights. But we also support employers, hopefully at an equal level, to advocate for productivity, for jobs growth, for economic growth, so that jobs can be created. I think there is a perception that ILO is a labor organization. People associate us with the trade union agenda.
Okay.
But we also have this other agenda that people don't often talk about, is supporting the business growth. If you just do one, we're not going to benefit anyone. If we don't have jobs, we can't have what we call decent or fair jobs. We'll have a lot of unemployed people, and that's much worse than not having jobs at all. So in Nepal and many places in the world, we try and balance these 2 things, although people often see us as just working on that one side, the workers' side.
But there is different problem which might not be happening in other developed or other countries. Here are lots of labor unions rather than having single common labor union, you know. And all labor unions are backed by political parties with political parties' interest rather than having the interest of the laborers. So what do you say? So having lots of labor unions creating too much disturbances to the industries, and ILO, who is supposed to be involved in these issues, is looking and just watching there.
Well, over the years, I think you've seen an improvement in Nepal. There are lots of unions, but there are about 3 major trade union confederations.
Okay.
And at the national level, I'd say they work pretty well together. You know, a while back they formed the JTUCC, which is a coordination body for the 3 trade unions. And each of those unions participates and leads that committee on a rotating basis. Now, this coordinated unit actually negotiated on the new labor law and the new social security law as a compact, as a group. So they work well together on this. So I think if you were to look 10, 15 years ago, what you say would be completely accurate. But we have to also see the progress that's been made in bringing these major trade unions together. Despite different political parties, they managed to see the common goal of actually stimulating economic growth, producing more jobs, but also ensuring those jobs are decent. So if you look at the new labor law, for example, you see there's a nice balance between those 2 things. Now, this is a law in theory. It has to be implemented. But we have to give the trade unions credit for coming together in a unified way, despite the different political backings.
Okay. If we judge or if we analyze the development history of the developed country, at the developing phase, they didn't talk about the labor law. After being developed, they start talking about the labor law and other things, human rights, other things. But country like Nepal, who is just moving slowly towards development, and at this moment, the development sector is so embedded by the rights only rather than having duty. So how could a country like Nepal get rid of right-oriented perception?
So if I understand you correctly, you feel that workers are very well aware of their rights, but not often of their obligations to do their jobs. I mean, I think that's a problem anywhere. Even as an ILO staff, we often think of what we're entitled to, but really what we have to deliver to get those things.
Exactly.
If you look at the labor law again that was just passed, I think it's swinging us a little closer to the duty side, because there's a clause or several clauses in the law that make it very possible for companies to fire workers if they're not doing their jobs. Now, in the past, we see labor laws across Asia in particular, which are very protective and make it very difficult for workers to be fired. And that's a problem for everyone, not just for businesses, because if companies can't let workers go, if they can't downsize when business is slow, they won't make new jobs when opportunities arise. They'll be reluctant to take on that obligation if they know they can't reduce it. So the new law does allow for hire and fire in exchange for social security for workers. So that's a very elegant compromise.
We'll talk later on that issue.
I agree with you 100%.
Okay.
Everyone has an obligation to do their job. That's first and foremost. But at the same time, those rights should be enforced and protected.
Okay. If we take ILO Nepal or ILO, maybe ILO Qatar, ILO Saudi, ILO Malaysia, if we take isolated form, it will be mistake. We should take them as a ILO headquarters, particular units. Okay. So there are 2 types of country in terms of labor sending country and labor receiving countries. Nepalese labor who are getting what extent of right in Nepal, they are not getting that extent of right in the countries where they go and work. And ILO is also here, ILO is also there. And in Europe, there is fair trade also. Concept of fair trade means if you don't implement human right and particular labor rights, they don't purchase the products manufactured from these countries. But Malaysia is sending, Europe is the hub of the Malaysian products. And in some contexts, Europe is having good tie-up with Gulf countries who don't implement the labor rights. So what do you say about this?
Well, It's a big question. There are a lot of things here. So let's touch on the issue of the labor rights in labor receiving countries. So you look at Malaysia, you look at Qatar, UAE, countries that absorb a lot of Nepali people.
Okay.
Now, here we have a very nice labor law in theory, not always implemented, but it's there in theory. Now, in countries like Malaysia, you do have a fairly solid labor law, but is that law applied to migrant workers, to non-Malaysian workers? And the answer is it generally is not fully applied. So what you see in many countries in the world, there's a double standard between our workers in our country and those workers we bring here to do work.
I'm asking the question.
Now that we do not accept. The ILO position is clearly that workers, regardless of their national origin, should have fair and decent jobs, access to decent work.
Exactly.
Now that's a big goal. It doesn't happen overnight. So a lot of our migration programming in those receiving countries is advocating for that. It's starting with the most pressing needs of workers that face in those countries. Safety in the workplace, occupational safety and health is critical in the construction industry, for example, in manufacturing. So we have to sort of prioritize what the biggest challenges are in those countries and work slowly over time to address them. It doesn't happen overnight. You see, for example, Qatar moving towards abolishing this kafala system, which makes it very difficult for workers to change jobs when they're in conditions of work which are not fair. So that is, the Qatar government has made some real progress in the past 6-8 months. And ILO will work with them increasingly in the future to push those even further. Same thing in Malaysia. We have to recognize some progress has been made. But the ILO position clearly is workers, no matter what their national origin, should have access to decent work. Now you mentioned fair trade. So for example, in many places in the world, in developed markets, we see consumer and stock market pressure on companies to only source products where there is decent work. Now there, in most cases, the awareness of consumers and the stock markets is on issues like child labor, for example. If, say, a large company like, I don't want to say Gap or Zara, these big garment retailers, if it is identified that somewhere in their supply chain they have either child laborers or trafficked workers, you will see their business could drop fundamentally. So that's not a bad thing because it puts pressure through the supply chain to improve. Unfortunately, in many sectors, we don't see that kind of pressure applies. So if you work in a construction business, a small construction agency, without safety and health gear, with many people having accidents in a particular country, there's not that necessarily awareness of consumers that that's not acceptable. So we actually need more public understanding of the right of migrant workers in receiving countries to have what we call decent work, safe and fair jobs, that salaries are paid on time, that wages are fair, on line with national standards, that workplaces are safe, and that there's social security and health care for workers as well. These are things that all workers deserve.
Okay, so I'm going through your one sentence. What you told is you don't take any labor as domestic or foreigners. For you, all labor are equal. And the country, labor receiving country or any country should treat all laborers equally. That is in your charter, but not in practice.
Right.
So what are you doing there?
What you see, let's just take the whole migrant worker issue and realize that some of the responsibility on ensuring decent work for migrants starts here at home in Nepal.
Okay.
So we have to make sure that, for example, migrants have the information about the countries they're going.
Okay.
We have to make sure they have the skills that they can acquire good quality jobs when they do migrate. We have to make sure that recruitment processes do not place financial burden on migrant workers. A lot of high costs and fees on fees, which often end up migrant workers, by the time they get to their country of destination, are already in debt for many years. That makes them more vulnerable when they're working overseas. Now, ILO in those receiving countries should be working with those governments to enforce labor law for all workers, labor inspection so that workplaces are monitored regularly to see that they are compliant, that workers understand their rights under the law in those countries, that there's mobility, that they're able to quickly leave jobs that are not fair, take other jobs in those same countries. So much can be done to work with those governments and put international pressure on them to comply with international labor standards. So ILO also has what we call a governing body, which basically, globally, 188 member states appoint a selected few to monitor situations of labor and working conditions across the globe. So if there are complaints, as there have been in many of the GCC countries, for example, ILO can investigate those, and they go to the global court, the ILO governing body, and decisions are made about those countries, and recommendations are given to those countries to improve. Generally, over time, we see that countries do respond to that kind of pressure. So there's global pressure, there's country-level support, but there's also obligation here in Nepal that we do our share to make sure migrant workers are prepared and not unduly indebted in the process of going overseas.
Okay. So the Nepal recently introduced two laws, labor law and social security law. While formation of that law, ILO had also played a crucial role, and these laws implemented some of the key issues raised by the private sector, so like hire and fire and no work, no pay, some you can say. These laws are supposed to be a milestone to have the employer-employee relation. What do you say about this?
They are a milestone. They do reflect a very elegant compromise between the trade unions and the businesses on hire and fire in exchange for Social Security. Now that comes with a cost. Now under the new laws together, companies do have that flexibility, but at the same time they have obligations. So both employers, management, and workers will have to both contribute to Social Security schemes to cover things like pensions and unemployment insurance and things that workers need. So now under the new laws, in theory, if I work for you and you fired me, maybe I wasn't doing my job, or maybe you just can't afford me anymore, then I would have access at some point to unemployment insurance, which would allow me some time to look for another job and not face economic catastrophe of not having work. So that's a nice compromise. Now actually making those laws a reality is a lot more work. And what we need to do here in Nepal is businesses and workers both need to understand the laws, understand their obligations, their responsibilities under the law, as well as their rights. And we are a long way of really getting that knowledge down to the factory level, down to the business level. So we have to really step up our efforts in communicating the details of these laws. But a lot needs to be done to determine how these laws will be implemented under the new federalist structure. So a lot of changes happening. So we have to really think fast and move fast to bring these laws to implementation.
दर्शकबिन हामी कुरा गरिरहेका छौँ डाक्टर रिचार्ड हावर्डसँग। उहाँ चाहिँ आइएलओ अफिस फर नेपालका चाहिँ कन्ट्री डाइरेक्टर हुनुहुन्छ। हामी उहाँसँग कुराकानी जारी राख्नेछौँ तर एकैछिनको विश्रामपछि।
This program is sponsored by Hotel Nepal, Thamel, Kathmandu,
Himalaya Airlines, connecting Nepal to Doha, Colombo, Kuala Lumpur and Yangon.
दर्शकबिन पुनः स्वागत छ राष्ट्र विकासलाई आर्थिक बहस बिजनेस टेलिभिजनको विशेष प्रस्तुति बीटीभी विशेषमा हुनुहुन्छ यहाँहरु र हामीसँग हुनुहुन्छ डाक्टर रिचार्ड हावर्ड। उहाँ चाहिँ आइएलओ नेपालका कन्ट्री डाइरेक्टर हुनुहुन्छ। हामी उहाँसँग थप कुरा गर्छौं। वेलकम ब्याक सर। There are some fundamental issues which are not been resolved despite having debate of 2-3 decades. Labor unions should be working for the right of labor, but they are supposed to working for political parties here in Nepal. So what do you say and how you are working there?
Well, and to be fair, in many countries in the world, most countries, there is a link between labor unions and political parties.
Okay.
And often the ideologies of those parties are also in line with the needs and demands of workers. So not necessarily is it the case that politics is always in conflict with workers' needs. Maybe it's in conflict with employers' needs, you know, so there's a conflict there. I think the trade union movement here has matured significantly over the years, and sometimes there's unfair criticism that certain kinds of strikes taking place were instigated by the trade unions themselves, where they often were not the case. In fact, if we look at the percentage of strikes over the last 5 years, only 5% of strikes were actually labor-related strikes. And the other 95% were politically related. So there was a perception of blame for trade unions on all of those stoppages of work. So I think that's not entirely fair. Now, to say that, most of my experience with the trade unions is at the national level, and I do need to learn a lot more of what happens on the ground, the dynamics, the link between politics and how that interplays with worker activities at local level, at factory level. So, you know, we need to look closely at this, because we certainly do not want that to be the case.
So we'll go to some other sectors as well. You have experience of working in developed countries and getting experience from developing countries as well. So, and you are observing the political change in Nepal as well. So how do you see the Nepal structural changes of governance, federal system, and how do you analyze these future perspectives?
I think, you know, a lot of changes on the horizon. We don't fully understand how federalism will take place. But overall, I'm optimistic. I think whenever local governments become empowered, control over their resources, can determine how they develop, how they create jobs, that's a very positive thing. And if I look at our partners in Nepal, the trade unions and the private sector, the employers' organizations, are very excited about federalization. They think it will bring opportunity. So from the government side, I think from our traditional partners, the thinking on how they can benefit from federalization, for example, from the perspective of implementing the labor law and the social security law, that thinking isn't quite as far. But there are also opportunities there too. So overall, I think there's a lot of optimism, but the details have not yet been worked out yet.
Okay, you have told us in the initial of the program, so the concern, one of the major concern of the ILO is also the creating jobs. And if you see last 10 years, job creation is in negative ratio if we exclude the tourism sector. So what are you doing to create more jobs in Nepal?
Well, ILO has to work in collaboration with other, you know, with the government, with the National Planning Commission, with World Bank, and all these other major players that have a lot more influence on the economy than us. But we have to do our part. So what I see ILO, how we can contribute to job growth, one, for example, is make sure this law is implemented, because that will ensure harmonious industrial relations. If we go back to a situation in the 90s where you had job growth, you had factories growing, but industrial relations broke down, that will be a disaster. We can't go back there again. Okay. So ILO obligation is to work with those partners to make sure we have sound industrial relation as growth occurs. That's our number one homework. Other issues that we can contribute to are labor market information. We're conducting a labor force survey right now. It gives us an understanding of not only what's happening in the job market now, but we can project to the future what the trends will be. Okay. That has implication for things like skills. Skills is a very important area. What you see in Nepal, you know, many of our highest skilled workers are going out. There's a shortage of skilled labor here, despite a large technical and vocational training system. If you talk to any company, they will tell you that they can't find the skilled workers they need. That's what we call a skills gap. So we need to work with the TVET system and also with private sector to make sure that they together can access or create the skilled workforce that is needed to grow. We can't grow without skilled workers.
Okay, but if you talk about the skilled workers, most of the Nepalese are in developed countries, and there is massive risks of brain drain as well. Do you have any concern on these issues?
It's kind of a catch-22, is that the skilled workers won't come back to Nepal until you have the jobs,
Okay.
but it's hard to create the jobs unless you have the skilled workers. But many countries have gotten through this. If you look at Vietnam, a large portion of those people that left the country post Vietnam War came back. The younger generation came back. So Nepalis are very much like this. They're very proud to be Nepali. When there is growth, when there are opportunities, those skilled people will come back. Many of them will come back. So I'm very optimistic. You see it in China. A lot of the people who left Hong Kong, for example, are coming back, working in the mainland. Cambodia, you see similar trends. But it's our obligation to create the opportunities here, and the people will come, I believe.
Okay, it is supposed that around 500,000 of the youngsters are entered into job market every year, and we can say around 2%, 3% only job creation in market, and most of the people are being unemployed and going for foreign employment. So how do you analyze, or how is your projection, when Nepal will be able to provide jobs to them, at least 60-70% of the youngsters who enter into job market?
It's complicated, I find, because on the one hand, we have these high youth unemployment numbers, but on the other hand, we have shortages of workers in many sectors, in construction, for example. And what we see is that young people, it's not just lack of opportunity here, but it's also
They are choosy.
an unwillingness to do certain kind of jobs here in Nepal that they may be willing to do overseas. If you look at a construction job, actually, if you compare what it's like to work on your typical construction site here versus Qatar, and if I were choosing, I would choose Qatar, because it's probably safer, despite what people think. So we need to improve here too, working conditions and wages, but it's not just wages, because wages here are often going up. And also people's perceptions about doing certain kinds of work. We have to all be willing to do jobs that are available in our own country. So I think changing perceptions about work need to take place too. Young people's views on entrepreneurship are another issue. People often want the job with a big bank or the private sector or the civil service, but not as many people are favoring starting their own businesses. And there are a lot of opportunities here. So I think we need to change perceptions about entrepreneurship itself.
There are always controversial in the interest of employer and employee, as it happens everywhere in the world. So in Nepal particularly, employers always want duty first and labor always want right first. In this context, you are working with the Employer Council of FNCCI, CNI, as you told, and the government itself is a big employer, we can say. In this context, how could the private sector's, we can say, job ratio could be increased?
In terms of employing more people? Well, I think overall, if we look at what's needed to increase jobs in the country, I think further opening the economy for foreign investment would also be a big boost for job increases. It's still a very big struggle for someone to come in and invest money in Nepal. Maybe not as severe as other South Asian countries. You see Nepal ranks pretty well, but still we need to do a lot better to attract foreign investment. Tourism also has huge potential, and it's growing, but the infrastructure is not really there yet to bring in millions, and we're just targeting 1 million. But But Nepal deserves a lot better than 1 million tourists a year. It has way too much to offer. But we need a better airport. We need airports throughout the country. We need safe air travel. All these things that will get tourists here, they have to be in place, and the government has a big role to play in that. I know that they're taking steps now, but it does take time. So we have to look sector by sector, what the needs, what the constraints are, and then work together to address those. It won't happen overnight, but I think progress is underway.
I had asked one question in the very beginning of the interview that if ILO raises some issue to the fair trade, like the country like Malaysia and some countries, there is chances of having FDI more in Nepal, because Nepal is implementing more labor law and more labor law friendly, we can say. So, are you promoting the country like Nepal, who have better labor law, should have more investment?
I think that happens naturally in the market anyway. You see certain businesses, multinational enterprises. I don't want to mention countries' names, but there are cases in South Asia where companies have left because of working conditions, and you don't want that. We don't want that. So here, I think we're on a pretty good base. The potential to attract investment based on working conditions is there, but the other challenges for businesses are really still very profound. I mean, if a company finds it difficult to bring money into the country to invest, that's a problem. If it finds it hard to take money out, profits out, that's also a problem. Some very basic things have to be worked out. But the labor conditions are pretty much, not too bad here. So I think that will be an advantage for Nepal, ultimately.
So, in some cases, what we are finding in Nepal is they are under the public circumstances. It means domestic laborers, maybe underwage laborers, maybe foreign but illegal laborers who don't shout for their law or any labor laws. So in these cases, what are you doing?
Well, the biggest challenge here in Nepal, when you look at labor law, is what we call the informal sector. So it's the small businesses. Under the old labor law, any business with less than 10 people didn't have to adhere to labor law. They didn't have to follow the law. Under the new law, the law applies to everyone.
Exactly.
But really, what does that mean? It's going to take years and years before your small-scale construction worker can benefit from labor law. Same thing with domestic household workers, domestic workers. They're not traditionally covered by labor law, but now they are. I think trade unions do have an important role to play to organize these workers in the small-scale industries, to bring them together so they do know their rights and their obligations under the law. So I think trade unions have to play a role in moving more into what we call the informal economy.
In some cases, I'd like to give you some examples. Like in some cases, human rights organizations, in some cases, like we can say IFC also, imposes some countries, like in Nepal also, they have imposed some issues. If they don't pass some acts, they will be blacklisted, like that. So, but in Nepal, you are working here closely with the employers and employees, and labor unions are directly intact with the political parties, with the, we can say, wrong interest. They are disturbing industry. At that time, can't you say, don't have any such intention in the
industry? I mean, the ILO is not the kind of organization that stands over people's shoulder telling them what to do. I mean, because we are, who is the ILO? They're the ministries of labor, they're the trade unions and the employers' organizations. They run the organization. They sit on the governing body, they make decisions, they pass the international labor standards, and at national level, they decide what to implement and what not to implement. We don't impose things on them. So they set the standard, and they decide how to implement that standard at country level.
Okay.
And our office, we provide them technical support on what they decide. Now, of course, the tricky thing is if you had severe violations, if you had trade union leaders put in jail, workers that were not allowed to negotiate for their rights, what we call these fundamental rights, if you had rampant child labor, if you had large numbers of trafficking, that's where ILO office has to put a little bit of pressure on our partners to remind them of their obligations as members of the ILO. Now, those aren't major, we've made such good progress on those issues here in Nepal, so I'm not talking about Nepal now. But we're not that kind of pointing down, telling you what to do international agency, because we are comprised, you are the agency. We are the service provider.
So there are some two kinds of things. One thing is, so if you see the constitution of Nepal, there are some fundamental rights. Among that, right to work is one of the fundamental right, and right to do business is another fundamental right. You raise your voice if labor unions, we can say employee is, we can say misjustice or somewhat treated under the law, but you don't raise the voice of the private sector. There's a blaming, to you, because these are parallelly to fundamental rights. Doing business is also fundamental right, and working is also fundamental right.
Right, and they're not necessarily in contradiction.
Okay.
I mean, right to work means you have to work.
Okay.
It doesn't mean you have a right to have a job and not work. Okay. You have a right to work, but you must work. And the right to do business has a right to do business as long as you don't violate the fundamental human rights of workers. And you can do business without doing that. Okay. It's actually more sound business.
What I'm telling is, if a labor union does a strike illegally, you don't say anything.
Well, I mean, again, we support employers and workers to engage in a dialogue where they can negotiate what's right and wrong. They will, over time, balance out to a fair decision that works for both sides. I do believe that. Occasionally things get out of balance, and people recognize that that's not good for the country, and it's not good for the workers ultimately.
Okay, so if we discuss like that, it cannot be concluded. So let's try to
never conclude.
Yeah. Let's try to conclude. What could be the best practices in the world, as you have witnessed lots of practices in the world? What kind of practices could be adopted by the Nepalese private sector, maybe Nepal government or Nepal labor unions, so to have a best conducive environment to do business, to grow economy, and to have win-win situations?
That's a big question. Okay. I mean, the best case environment where we don't steer too close in any direction. That, for example, I believe it's the government's role to mitigate between these two parties, the workers and the employers, to make sure we get that balance right. That we have policy that promotes job growth, that we create an environment conducive to foreign investment and domestic investment and small and medium enterprise growth. We have to get all that right. But at the same time, we have to implement this labor law to protect rights of workers. And you mentioned a point earlier, which is a very good point. Countries at different stages of development have different abilities to provide certain levels of remuneration, wages for workers, other kinds of benefits. Those grow over time. So it shouldn't be the case that we take European standards of wages and social security and apply them here, because it's not possible. The system won't bear it and still allow for job growth. So it's the ability for government and workers and employers to think where they are in the growth trajectory now and get that balance right and realize it will change over time. And what we call social dialogue, the working together between government, employers, and workers, is the only way they can do that. And our role at ILO is to provide them the analysis they need so they can make the right decisions over time.
Okay, thank you very much for your time, sir. दर्शकवृन्द हामीले कुरा गर्यौँ रिचार्ड हावर्डसँग। उहाँ चाहिँ ILO नेपालका कन्ट्री डाइरेक्टर हुनुहुन्छ र हामीले समग्र देशको विकासमा लेबर र खास गरी रोजगारदाता र रोजगार लिने जुन श्रमिकहरू हुन्छन् उनीहरूको रिलेसन कस्तो हुनुपर्छ र ILOले इन्टरनेसनली पनि कसरी फेसिलिटेट गरिरहेको छ भन्ने विषयमा हामीले कुरा गर्यौँ। आजको लागि बिटिभी विशेष यति नै। तपाईँ बिजनेस टेलिभिजन सेटसम्म पुग्न नसक्ने अवस्था छ भने बिजनेस टिभी नेपाल टाइप गर्नुहोस्, इन्स्टल गर्नुहोस् र विश्वभरबाट प्रत्यक्ष हेर्न सक्नुहुन्छ। अहिले बिदा दिनुहोस्, नमस्कार।
This program is sponsored by Hotel Nepal, 6 Mile, Kathmandu.
Himalaya Airlines, connecting Nepal to Doha, Colombo, Kuala Lumpur and Yangon.